Each man must do his bit.
Hi, hello, and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. I'm Gabriela Patram. We're so happy that you can join us. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and leader of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, hello and welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's always a pleasure to be on the program.
Okay. So today I want us to have some discussions or talk about a little bit about over the past week we would have seen a 4-day state visit from the president of Suriname, and I want us to talk a little bit about that, the engagement, some of the agreements that were signed and so forth. On that note, visits were exchanged in 2020 and August of this year respectively, which was the past week. What has been the effects of these visits? That's my first question to you today.
In general, I would say the visits are necessary,
Okay.
but they're not sufficient. From the time of President Burnham, our first executive president, even when he was prime minister, there were exchange visits between the leaders of Suriname, the leaders of Guyana. Suriname is our closest CARICOM neighbor. In fact, Suriname and Guyana are the only two CARICOM countries which share a border. And it has always been prudent for Guyanese leaders to exchange visits. And fortunately, the Surinamese leaders have reciprocated. So the effect is generally very calming to assure the populations on both sides of the creek, that quarantine creek, that we are not fighting one another and that we are prepared to talk to each other. However, they're not enough. They are necessary but not sufficient. It is important for the visits to have some policy foundation, and that is why the policymakers must meet. This is a saying, countries touch at their summits, and the summits are important. But at the next level, there is the professional or bureaucratic engagement. That is, the foreign services, the foreign ministries must engage with each other. And at the next level still, there must be an engagement of people-to-people contact, culture, sport, and so on. And of course, the majority of people who come and go across the borders, who interact, have needs, like passports and currency and that type of thing. They need consular attention. So the visits were very important, and within the first a few months, I think in November 2020, President Ali went to Suriname, and now before the first year is completed, you find that President Santoki has come over. So the general effect is good, but we must not be swayed or, by what we think is going to happen. This has been going on for over 50 years. And in fact, the impact is quite moderate. It is not, I know there's been a lot of hype about the visits, but things move very slowly when it gets to the bureaucracy and when it gets to the nuts and bolts of the agreements and the relationship between the two countries. In fact, despite the persistence of visits over the last 50 years, I would say that some aspects of the relationship between Guyana and Suriname have been more adversarial than Guyana and any of the other CARICOM countries. Some of the things which have occurred, have not occurred between Guyana and other countries. So we need to continue talking. Otherwise, I feel the relationships could deteriorate and could degenerate into more unpleasant situations. So I would say that the effect is calming, soothing for the time being, but it will take some time before we see a forward movement. Forward movement is not going to take place suddenly between Guyana and Suriname. It takes time.
Sir, both presidents, the president of Guyana and Suriname, are are new to their posts, having been elected in August and July of 2020 respectively. How similar are their approaches to the two countries' relations?
They're two different people. Well, President Santokhi is a devout Hindu,
Yes.
and I think at his inauguration he actually recited Hindu mantras. And of course, President Ali is a devout Muslim. And when he visited Suriname, he addressed the Surinamese Muslims, I think. But apart from that, President Ali is 41 years old, President Santokhi is 62 years old. President Santokhi is a policeman. He's a trained policeman. He was a commissioner of police. He was Minister of Justice. And sometime in his career, he actually took President Bouterse to court. He might have been Commissioner of Police or Minister of Justice at the time a very notorious Guyanese narcotics trafficker was arrested. So I think Santokhi is a very serious man, and he's highly regarded in the counter-narcotics arena in this part of the hemisphere. He's not a pushover, he's very experienced, and
Excuse me.
His approach, I think, is more methodical, based on his experience, based on his expertise in that field, and based on his own expectations. President Ali comes from a different background, and we'll have to see, they're certainly dissimilar. We'll have to see how they proceed in this Guyana-Suriname relations. Now, there was a time when Mr. Rohi was the Minister of Home Affairs, and he had relations with Mr. Santokhi, who at that time was Minister of Justice. I'm not quite sure what all of the functions of Minister of Justice are in Suriname, the two different jurisdictions. But the relationship is based on the law. And Guyanese sometimes have been playing, a bit easy on the law, particularly in terms of backtracking. And I mean, everyone knows that the Guyana-Suriname border is a zone of contraband and people smuggling, gun running, and narco trafficking. And I got the impression that Mr. Santokhi is much more firm, much more serious. The Guyana government was much more tolerant to backtracking. I remember reading applications by some businessmen to institutionalize backtracking because they say it's quick. They could just go over to Nigeria and be back, in New Amsterdam or Craverton in a few hours and get a business transacted. But of course you can't conduct international relations in an illegal manner. And this has been one of the sticking points, and I think that Mr. Santokhi is a stickler for the law. And I'm sure that however the relation develops between them, he will obviously maintain Suriname's interest first, and it would be lawful, and I think he is going to try to suppress illegal activities across the border. And it will be a test for Guyana. It will be a test for Guyana's law enforcement agency, and of course, eventually be a test of the presidency. I'm quite sure that although there are two different personalities, we will be able to get some cooperation as long as Guyana intends to adhere to the law governing crops and sanitary measures, for import and export of commodities, law governing movement of persons, and so on. So it's not going to be easy, but as I pointed out a little earlier, at the professional level, we must get bureaucrats, we must get government officers who respect the law and enforce the law. And in that regard, I think it will be easier for the two presidents, despite their different backgrounds. It will be easier for the two presidents, Mr. Ali and Mr. Santokhi.
Sir, I'm subject to correction here. Guyana, I have here Guyana and Suriname would have established a strategic dialogue cooperation platform to generate synergies. I hope that I have that correct. And on that note, how is this platform expected to function?
As I said, Gabby, we've had, this is deja vu. We've had all of this over the last 50 years.
Okay.
It is basically, in my interpretation, and I can only judge from what has been printed in the media, it is basically concerned with functional cooperation, with transportation, with health, business, sport. I don't see that it is a new initiative.
Okay.
I don't see that it will deliver any services which we do not enjoy at present. We have a long history of cooperation, and unfortunately much of that cooperation, a substantial part of that cooperation, has not been successfully implemented. So there's a problem of implementation, not just creation of a platform of the institution. There's a problem of implementation when it gets down into the bureaucracy. The presidents could talk about platforms and cooperation. When you get to the bureaucrats, the engine room of diplomacy, that is when you could run into literally troubled waters. And the waters between Guyana and Suriname have been troubled for all of the last 50 years or more.
Yeah. And sir, on that same note, we would have seen quite a few controversy between the waters in terms of fishermen. Even I read that the Surinamese opposition leader would have objected to their proposal for the issuance of licenses for Guyanese fisher folk. Can you share with us what has caused the controversy between the two countries in this area?
At the root of the relationship between Guyana and Suriname is a territorial question.
Okay.
That is the start of all of our problems. And once you're talking about problems in fishery or licensing, we're talking about the definition of the sovereignty of the territory of Suriname. And I would say the regime is quite harsh in terms of the role that Guyanese fisherfolk, or the freedom of Guyanese fisherfolk to operate. And there are two real types of licenses. One is, I think, the SK license, which is the coastal license. One, the BV license, which is the riverine license. According to the Surinamese definition, literally, the territory starts at the high level watermark of the Corentyne River. I think this is quite perverse myself. It means that if you're at Oreala or Separuta and you literally step into the river when it's at high water level, you're in Surinamese territory. It's an absurdity. It's a diplomatic absurdity. And several Amerindian fishermen have been harassed from time to time. But one of the big problems Guyanese complain about is the harassment. It's not about the law. I think Guyanese fishermen are prepared to obey the law, but sometimes Surinamese officials have been accused of shaking down Guyanese, demanding the best fish or money which is not due to them. So it is a question of jurisdiction. It is a question of sovereignty. If you've seen a picture of the Kanawaima ferry, it has a Surinamese flag. If you commit an offense on the ferry, you'll be tried in a Surinamese court. It's a very harsh regime. It's not a friendly regime. I think as far as the licenses are concerned, that is the root of the problem. There have been other issues too, as you may know. It took maybe 16 or 17 years for the Kanawaima ferry to come into fruition because of the objection of the Surinamese to the jurisdiction problem on that ferry. And they probably felt that they needed it, and Guyanese needed it, and Guyanese had to make certain adjustments. Then, of course, there was the question of the actual jurisdiction of the Quarantine River. And as you know, a decade or two ago, we had to go to the court because at that time, the definition of the boundaries, particularly in terms of petroleum, offshore petroleum exploration, had to be determined. As you know, at one stage, the Surinamese Navy, if you can call it that, expelled an unarmed CGX petroleum platform from Guyana's waters. So this is very unfriendly behavior. Well, it's hostile behavior. They used armed patrol boats to expel the CGX platform, and eventually it went to the court, and the court decided, the international court decided in our favor. So you had the problems with Kanawayama, you had the problems with jurisdiction, you have problems with fisheries, you have problems with the CGX seizure, and at a more irritating level, which some people may encounter on a day-to-day basis, they continue to draw their maps showing the entire New River zone as part of Surinamese territory. And they try to embarrass Guyanese delegations by giving them tokens showing this absurd map, you know, with Guyanese, the whole New River zone, which is bigger than Jamaica, as part of Surinamese territory. And people, I've seen a photograph, Guyanese officials go to sign an agreement, and behind them is this absurd map, you know, and Guyanese diplomats have had to be instructed not to accept any documents or any tokens or to participate in any agreements where the map of Guyana is distorted to show the New River Triangle being part of Surinamese territory. So all of these things have been happening over the last 50 years, and the controversies are not you know, on fisheries alone. It's a whole bundle of issues which the Surinamese keep bringing to the table, and that has been a major impediment. This is my hope, and certainly while I was president, this matter had not been resolved. No president has been able to resolve it. In fact, 1 year under President Jagdeo, Mr. Venetian, who was the president at that time, came to our National Assembly on our Independence Day, I think it was the 26th of May. And he said, the problem is the territorial problem. You know, it's not about weather, it's not about smuggling, territorial problem. And Guyanese have to understand that. Guyanese have to educate themselves and not take it for granted. Because the Surinamese know everything about what they call the bovine quarantine, upper quarantine, which we call the New River. And that is the heart of the problem. So we are really, we have not really made much progress on the territorial problem, except for the definition of the maritime zone, that maritime boundary. But frankly, the other boundaries, that is the New River, the Quarantine River boundary, are technically unresolved. And that's where we are now. So the controversies have been arising because of the territorial question. And no Surinamese president has ever failed to put the territorial question on the table during negotiations or discussions. And I noticed from the newspapers that this was breezily dismissed. It's not going to happen like that. You know, you don't say it will not solve itself. And I do not think that the so-called Border Commission is working assiduously to resolve the controversy. And given the fact that that border ought to have been defined or determined, since 1936, we went into independence in 1966 with a draft treaty. That treaty has never been assented to, and as we stand now, there is no acknowledged definition of our demarcation of that boundary. And it causes a lot of confusion because there has been a tendency on the part of some persons, even some officials, to accept that a boundary which technically does not exist is in fact a legal boundary. We need to get the matter sorted out, but my interpretation is that it is the source of some dissension and discontent, and it is a drag on Guyana-Suriname relations.
Sir, the GDF, the Guyana Defense Force, would have conducted conducted a military operation to defend the New River Zone against Suriname's occupation in August 1969. Do I have that year correct?
Yes.
1969. What has been the significance of that New River operation?
Well, it's probably the most significant event in the collective memory of the Surinamese nation in terms of its relations with Guyana. It was, Guyanese call it Operation Climax, and in many ways it was the climax of relations between the two countries. The Surinamese came into our territory. I'll try to summarize. The Surinamese came into our territory and conducted certain explorations in the New River Triangle, which belongs to Guyana. They actually constructed a military camp with bunkers and watchtowers and armed men, built a long airstrip. And in 1969, August, the Guyana Defense Force was obliged to go into the New River and expel the Surinamese who were there. The Surinamese called the camp Tigri, and we called the camp Jaguar. And since then, the Republic of Guyana has remained in control of the New River territory. And all of our maps are drawn in accordance with that demarcation. And since then, the Surinamese have used the question of Tigri as a means of opposing Guyana. Even Mr. Parmesar, I think that's his name, Parmesar, he's the leader of the opposition, or NDP, in the National Assembly. He cited that as a reason why licenses should not be given to fishermen in the Atlantic. He goes all the way back to Tigri, or Jaguar as we call it, to justify the denial of fishing licenses to Guyanese fisherfolk. So you can see that it rankles. You can see that at the strategic level, the issue has never been accepted. At the diplomatic level, it is still a stumbling block, and also, I would say, at the bureaucratic level, maybe even the National Assembly, you still find parliamentarians, you still find bureaucrats who use Tigri, everything's about Tigri, as a stumbling block to any sort of progress. And it contributes to bureaucratic sloth. It contributes to what I perceive as an unwillingness to get on with the other issues. And there's a saying, that nothing is settled till it's settled right. And, if you pay attention to what some of the Surinamese have been saying over the years, you can see that there is still great dissatisfaction with the outcome of the operation in 1969. So a lot of factors led to that operation, because there had been attempts to do hydrographic surveys in the river, because the flow from the New River is quite, at certain times of the year, is quite heavy. And the Surinamese had intended to use the New River waters to develop hydropower potential for the bauxite industry. Guyana and Suriname were very rich in bauxite. And for that reason, they felt that the flow coming from the Quarantine River, which has its source in the Kutari, was inadequate So they're not satisfied with the river, which is the legal boundary, but they want a river which is not the legal boundary. So they started to send hydrographic surveyors into Guyana's territory, and you had to expel them twice. The second time was more forceful. So they've never forgiven or forgotten Tigray in August 1969, and we will just have to have the matter resolved legally for their satisfaction, because once it is determined that New River is Guyanese territory, we can then go back to accepting the quarantine, which has its source in the Kutari. And it was in 1936 that the governments of the Netherlands, which at that time was responsible for Suriname, British Guyana, and Brazil, signed an agreement accepting the source of the Kutari as the source of the quarantine. But the Surinamese have never, although it was accepted in 1936, in 1966 they were not prepared to accept it. But it's there. It's there in all of our maps. So that is the long and short of the story. Surinamese have to accept the legal regime of the boundary, and they have not done that. They still draw their maps as if, the source of the New River was the boundary. It's not. It's Kutari.
Sir, as we wrap up, my final question. Over the last 52 years, there have been several engagements between Guyana and Suriname. What is your evaluation of these engagements?
The engagements have been only moderately successful, in my judgment, my evaluation. I think the Surinamese have a more professional approach to their foreign service. I pointed out that Mr. Ramdeen, for example, if you look at his service record over the last 30 years, he served in OAS, he served in career. He's a career diplomat. It's a serious appointment, and he has a serious record. I mean, must bear that in mind. You're not dealing with, political appointees. You're dealing with persons who are grounded in diplomacy, Caribbean diplomacy. The other thing is education. Our people at all levels must understand that the territorial issue is not some, academic matter which could easily be dismissed. They have to be educated. I remember a few years ago, a Guyanese head of state who does not speak Dutch, was engaged in a press conference, and most of the media present, were speaking Dutch, and I think his colleague had to interpret for him. But he said some things which they found, were unacceptable. I think in 1970 there was an agreement to demilitarize the zone, and they were accusing our president of not abiding by the agreement, when in fact they did not abide by the agreement. They have never accepted the agreement. So what I'm saying, there's an education element here that our diplomats, our politicians have to understand the whole border issue. There was an absurd situation too in the in early 2000, after the CGX platform had been removed, in which the Guyana president and the foreign minister tried to negotiate a solution to the problem. This problem is 100 years old. You don't put politicians to negotiate boundaries. You put experts, you put cartographers, you put legal experts. Eventually, they have to take it away from the politicians and put it in the hands of the court. You don't solve international territorial boundaries as if you're talking about trade and commodities. This is a highly technical field, so we have to get serious about our foreign service. You need a professional foreign service. You need career officers. You can't go picking, politicians' wives and retired politicians and putting them in charge of our foreign policy. You need to look at the persons who select for high office, particularly the foreign minister and the ambassadors. And you need to deal with the territorial problems which exist between Guyana and Suriname. They're not going to go away. They have to be dealt with decisively. And we have to understand you can't go into negotiations without planning. You cannot negotiate with Suriname on the basis of hope. Hope is not a strategy. Hope is not a diplomatic strategy. It will fail.
Sir, thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to have you here on the program. And to you, our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and on behalf of all of us here at Public Interest, we continue to encourage you to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.